Okay, so today we'll be starting the React lifecycle. We did React class, and the class has something called lifecycle. The lifecycle is just basically like use effect in functional JavaScript, a functional React. You guys used use effect usually when you're trying to do something like API call, things that are like a timeout, things like that, where you don't want that thing to affect the rendering of the application, basically. So you put that inside use effect. So the life cycles are basically just like use effect, but there is like multiple life cycles. Instead of just use effect, there's few of them in class component. Okay, every component in React has what we call lifecycle. The lifecycle is part of how our component operate under the hood. Being able to demonstrate understanding of React component lifecycle by knowing how to use few of the methods that we provide by it, that are provided by it. Okay, it will help you understand how and why React behaves the way it does at times. So at the end of this module or lecture, you should be able to describe 3 phases of a React component lifecycle. You should be able to properly explain what the constructor, the render methods do, and what their place in the React component lifecycle is. Use the component did mount function to set the component's state post-render. So we will learn all this stuff today, and we'll go over it. So the React component lifecycle is an important concept in React, and it also works in all React whenever you're trying to do things like API calls. And it was the first thing that when React was created, that was the first thing that they implemented was a React lifecycle. So here is a graph that we will go over later. But just in general, when the React component kind of renders, the process is it starts mounting. Basically, the React virtual DOM kind of like checks the normal browser DOM, and that's called mounting. And then if there's any changes that happens to the DOM or to the data, then it updates. And then after the component is done and you move out of the application or you close the browser, then it does the unmounted. So these are the kind of like the 3 phases, and we will break them down later. So we'll go over that. All right, so all this is good, but I wanted to kind of like show you a basic application that I put together, and I'll explain what the code is doing. So in this application, we have app class. This is one component, but it has another component here. So there's one component here, and then there's another component here, right? So, and we're exporting the main component, which is this. So this is a class component. And then we have the same way, we have functional component. So I called it app func. So when I zoom in, as you can see here, this is the main component, and this is another component. What we're going to do is I'm going to show you how the React component renders. Basically, what are the steps that it renders? So the steps are usually it renders first. It starts with the constructor. So when we go to the class has the constructor here. So where is the constructor? Okay, right here. The constructor is the first thing that gets built when you kind of started with the React component, when you start any React component. And then the next thing would be it renders the component. So renders, this is what it renders basically. So the UI, basically what are you going to see? That's the next step. So that's step 2. And then step 3 is then it renders anything that goes in component did mount. Component did mount, imagine that is use effect in function. So here, same thing. Ignore this top app, component, but this is our main component. This is a functional component. We have the state here, we have a couple of functions here. So we have two functions here. We have a console log. So this console log basically says that our constructor has rendered. So the functional component doesn't have an obvious constructor, but underneath the whole thing is a constructor that is running. So whenever you run the state is a constructor. So whenever you run the state, there's a constructor that is going to be built underneath. And these functions are also part of the constructor. So you can put it inside the constructor. So now here we console logged, we said, oh, the constructor has been built. The next step is, of course, the next step is the render. The render in functional component, we don't have actual render. It's not called render, but whenever it returns the UI, that's a render. So that's step 2. And step 3 is anything related to like use effect. So right here, we have a couple of use effects. So this is one use effect. We have another use effect here. The first use effect is basically, it kind of says that the component is updated. Basically, we rendered the component, so now it's updated, it's good. The next one is if we do any changes to the state. So if we do any changes to here, I mean to this state, then that this use effect kind of renders, not this one, this one. So let's run it and see. So we have to run one at a time. So now we can run the functional one. Let's open the browser. So I already opened it. So let's refresh. As you can see, this is the app. If we go to console, in the console, you can see how the process goes. The first step is it constructs. So the constructor runs. The next step is the render runs, which is the UI. And then the component mounts, basically it starts showing in the UI anything related to like component did mount, things like that, or use effect. And then it updates the use effect. And then lastly, it changes whatever it needs to change. And then it's done. So that kind of like, that's the process. The main thing you need to know is the steps of the constructor, render, and then the mounting. The mounting could be use effect. It could be component did mount. Component did mount will explain what it is, but it's also just the same as use effect. And then after that, whenever you do any updates, so now let's do an update. We're going to change Muhammad to Ahmed. So let's click make it Ahmed. So now we did an update. So now here you can see constructor and then render. The mounting didn't happen because the app is already mounted. We didn't unmount it. We didn't remove it from the UI. So we just updated we updated the UI and then we changed the name. So if we do another one, same thing, we just rendering and updating. We're not doing any mounting. Now let's unmount. So remember we had a here we had a component right here. We want to unmount that component. Basically, we want to remove it from the UI. So if we want to do that, we can click hide others. So this is the other component. If we click that, as you can see, it first runs a constructor, it runs the render, and then it runs component will unmount. Component will unmount is another function, just like component will component did mount. So component will unmount basically it's another function, another hook that removes anything from the UI. So that's kind of like the process. So now let's change that to class component, which is the same thing. So if we change this to class component, save it. Let's remove everything from here, refresh. Same thing. So it constructor runs, the render runs, which is the UI, and then it mounts. If we change something, as you can see here, it renders. Now it doesn't run the constructor again, especially when it comes to class components. It knows that the constructor is there, whatever the state, everything that's inside the constructor, it's going to stay there. So it's not worried. There's no changes to that. So it doesn't run that. Then it runs the update, which is, we change the name Hamid to basically Ahmed. That's basically what it's saying. And then if we do Farah, it's the same thing. It runs the render and then updates and then changes to Ahmed to Farah. Okay, and then if we remove, as you can see, it runs the unmount here. So all that is happening when you're basically running a React component. It's doing all that stuff under the hood. Okay, so that's just I wanted you to understand the steps that happens. The constructor, step one. So step one. Step one, constructor runs. Step two, the render runs. Render runs. Painting the UI. Painting the UI means it's going to show all the information in the browser. And then the last thing is anything related to component did mount, component will unmount, all that stuff. Component did update. Component did update runs when you want to update the state. Component did mount runs right after. So this runs right after the render component. So I'll call it CDM. Runs right after the render. So that's what it does all the time. And then this runs only when there is, this one is we'll call it CDU, runs only when there is a change in this state. Okay, so this runs only component that did update. The update runs only when there's a change in this state. So if we change anything from this state, then this one runs. So that's kind of like the process of this React components. Okay, so let's go to a website where it shows the life cycle of React. This website is really nice. You could say show less here, but before we do that, this is the graph that was shown here. We were showing this graph. The mounting process basically starts from the constructor, as I said, and then the render. And then there's another step that's called React Update, DOM, and Revs. So don't worry about that. That's a little more advanced than this. So this lesson, so we'll talk about that in the future. And then after that, the component that did mount runs. So this is kind of like the process of mounting a component in the UI. The next step is when you're trying to update. Updating, there's three things that will update the component. Three things. First is new props. If you have new props, then the component will update. If you change the state and say something like set state or whatever, set something, then, and if you run that and there's just something new, then what you had before, then the component updates and it runs render again. Keep in mind that whenever you run render, you're kind of like refreshing the UI. And then there's this function called force update. And if we actually click it, open it, here, the React team says normally you should avoid using or the uses of force update. Only read from this props or this state. So they actually discourage that you use force. There is 0 times that you will be using force update. There might be like in a large applications, there might be places where it might be applicable, but in general, you want to avoid that. Okay, so these are three ways that that update happens in the UI. or the component. And then after all these steps, then component did mount updates, component did update runs. The last thing is basically unmounting the component. And this is another hook or another function that runs. This runs basically usually it runs in the background. You don't even have to declare it. So it runs usually when you close the application, if you navigate somewhere else, all that stuff. So that's when it runs. We could also say here show less common lifecycle. So these are the more less common life cycles. There is a should comment update, a component update. There is a get derived state from props. There's a get snapshot before update. So these are kind of like you're never gonna use these. So I mean, you don't have to even learn them. So maybe like if you're working in like Facebook or something like that, they might come up, but in like small applications or medium applications, they don't come up. Okay, so that is in general, that's the process, that's the life cycle of React component. Any question about that? Any questions you guys have about that? And this is a really nice graph, so I'm gonna share with you guys. It's always good to keep that in mind and keep this in your bookmark it. Okay. All right. In that case, if you guys don't have any question, we will go ahead and get started with today's lesson. I mean today's application. So we'll build a quick application and go through the process of using component did mount, things like that, and changing the state and all that stuff. So let's go to code sandbox, create a new sandbox. Okay, and I'll call this component lifecycle lecture. Okay, so now all we need to do is we need to change this. So I'm gonna grab some CSS. So let's change this whole thing. Some CSS. Next thing is I'm gonna add some data. So I'm gonna create a new file. I'm gonna call it data.js. So this application will show like animal pictures and the name. These are like wild African animals. So let me just grab that data. So it's showing basically the name of the animal and then an image of the animal, and then it gives the ID. Oh, I have to change this ID too. So it's not an API, but it's gonna mimic an API. So actually there's something wrong with the IDs. So let me correct that. Okay, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 8, 9, 8, 9. All right, save that. Okay, so now in app.js, we need to set up the application. So that we're gonna change this to a class component. So let's just completely remove this. So we're gonna say class. It's the app.js. So we're gonna call it, yeah, it's just gonna be app extends react dot component, and then we're gonna do, before we do the state, all that, let's just do the render. It's always good to write things from scratch so that you have an idea of like how to do it with your own hands. Return, and here we're just gonna do that, an empty, we could say a div if we want, it doesn't matter. Okay. So here we're gonna say, let's put something like animal African, no, H2, H1, African wild animals, H1, okay. And also we have to import React, of course. R, okay. Okay, export default app. Okay, so we have that. Right here, I'm just gonna add class name, call it container. Okay, so you can see the font changes. The next thing we need to do is I'm gonna do one div here. So this div, I'm gonna give a class name of app. Okay, so we need to also create another component to render the state, but before we do that, let's bring in the state. So there's two ways to bring the state. We could do the constructor way. So we could say constructor, we could say super. And you have to keep in mind that you have to learn this like process of building the constructor. Keep in mind that you will see it in a lot of places. And then we say this dot state is equal to, and then we could render the state here. So let's render this data. Let's bring it in. Import, let's call it data from data. That's what's called, right? Yeah, we're just gonna call the name. And then here we're gonna say, let's call it animals and give it an empty array. Okay. So, and then we're gonna use, we can use component did mount to grab the data and then set it to the data, to the state. So let's create another components. Okay, so this we're going to create a component. I'm going to call it animals.js. So this is the one that kind of renders the animals for us. So this is going to be import React. So this one is going to do only rendering. So it's just going to receive a prop from app.js, and it's just going to render for us, and it's going to do the for loop, all that. It's going to do the mapping and all that for us. We also want to check a couple of things, but we'll talk about that later. Something related to props. Let me see. So yeah, so let's first build a, we're gonna make this one functional. It's fine. Animals, props, return, div. I'm just gonna render H2 animals here, and then export default animals. Okay, so yeah, we can show it here, right here. So we could say animals. It's gonna import automatically for us. That's it. So we have our app shown. So now what we can do is we can work on the state. Okay, can work on the state. So let's go here. So we're going to use component did mount. to set the state. Component did mount to set the state. So now what we're going to do is, so here, this is one way of showing the state. If you want, you could just get rid of all this on the constructor and just show the state itself only. You could also get rid of even this right here. And this is also valid, right? This is also valid because this, the class component assumes that, this is the state. Only if you're not using something else. Let's say a component did mount, you have another function inside it. I mean, not component did mount. The constructor, you have another function inside it. You cannot do like this. If you only have the state in your constructor, you could leave out the constructor. So React will automatically set up for you. So now, how do we update the state? We could use component did mount. Component did mount. So you have to write it like that. It's a big word. It's 3 words connected together. Component did mount, and then imagine this is the use effect. So we could do things like, so now if we want to set the state, we could say this dot set state, and this is how you change the state when it comes to class components. And then we're just gonna grab the data. So first you have to grab the current state. So we're just gonna say this dot state. That's the spread operator. And then the next line, we're gonna update the data. So we're gonna say animals, and then we're gonna grab the data from here. So animals data. Okay. So now if we save it, it's not gonna render anywhere. But let's kind of like let's console log it. Keep in mind that if you want to do console log, you cannot do it here. So that's how class components work. You have to do it inside the render. So let's call out state, and we're just gonna say this dot state. Save. Open this. Refresh. Yep. So our state is right here. We have 9 items, and each one is an object. As you can see, the first one is that with the link, all that stuff. So we have 9 of them. So I mean 8 of them. That's good. It says 9 of them. Yeah, 9 in an array. So that's good. Now the next thing is we need to render the data. So to render the data, we obviously have to pass it to this component, which renders. So let's call this something like animals is equal to, I'm just gonna say this dot state dot animals, because that's our state. Remember, our state is this dot state dot animals. So this is what we send in. And also when we're doing the console log, we could do this dot state dot animals, and we will have all the animals here. It's an object. Each one is an object. So save this. Let's remove this console log. Okay. Go back to animals. This, and here let's console log the props. Console log props. So as you can see, props shown the animals. Boom, boom. So that's great. We could also mark it. So we could say something like animals. So you can see exactly what we're looking for. All right, so we have the data. What we could do is we could do destruction like usual. We could do that. But let me just, yeah, we could do destruction. But we cannot do destruction because we didn't map over it yet. So we have like an array, and then the array has objects. So we have to map over it. Okay. So to map over it, we just do the usual stuff. So right here, we're just gonna do that. And let's say props.animals, because that's our prop name right here. It's our prop name. We're going to say props.animals.map. We do our usual stuff function. And here we're going to say animal, just the one animal. Okay. We could also use a class. We could also use a anonymous function too here. So we can use different things. It's not a big deal. So we're going to say animal, and then out of function, we're going to do that bracket, parenthesis, and inside here, we can render the different things that we want to render. So we can render like each animal, but before we do that, let's create a div here and give it a key. So remember, key helps us identify each animal. So React is kind of like it renders all of them with no problem. But if you don't give it a key, it will render no problem. But it will show a warning. It will say we don't have a key. There's no unique ID for each one of them. So let's just give it the ID, and let's say animal.id. And then let's give it a class here. Class name animals. Close this div. Okay. And here this is where we're gonna render all the information that we need. The first thing we're gonna render is the image. So let's render the image. Source will be animal.image. And here we're just gonna give it alt. It will not allow us until we give it alt. It will not render. This will be animal.name and close the image. As you can see, our images are shown. Boom, boom, boom. It's awesome. So let me just make this smaller. Maybe just bigger. If we didn't put the CSS yet. We're gonna put the CSS in a minute. But as you can see here, we only rendered the image and it's showing all the images. Now the next thing is the name of the animal. We're gonna put that in its own div. Gonna give it, let's close that div before we get confused. Give it a h2, h3. Give it h3 and render the name, animal.name. And here is h3. Okay, so you can see each animal has their name. So that's nice. So let's see if I'm missing any. Let's make this just a basic without the div here. Okay, return. Oh, this is supposed to be like that. Okay. Yep, so that's it. So as you can see, it's rendering how we wanted it to render. So that's great. So what we can do is if we go back to app.js, so let's save this first. If we go back to app.js, we want to render so that it kind of pretends like it's an API. So it kind of like does the circling and it waits for like a couple of seconds. So to do that, we can just put a set timeout inside the component did mount. So we could say set timeout. Set timeout takes a callback function. Set timeout. So we're gonna put all this stuff inside the set timeout. But set timeout needs another thing, which is the time it needs to set. So let's say 3 seconds. Now it's gonna wait 3 seconds and then it's gonna show the animals. So that's like pretending like it's an API, which is the thing that you will be using later. I mean, you already guys are used to APIs, but that's what happens usually when we try to render an API. There's a couple of things we could do. We could add like a circling thing, but this is kind of like the general idea of component did mount is you put all your what do you call the API calls, the things that are changing inside component did mount. This is how you set up your state, and then you render your data. So let's add one more thing, which is the spinning thing. So it looks nice. To add the spinning, we need to let's see. We need to put it right here. So let me just make this toggle. So right here, I'm just gonna say, the first thing I'm gonna say is I'm gonna check if there's any data. So to check if there's any data, you could just say this dot state dot animals dot length. If the length of the arrays, if they're equal to 0, they're equal to 0, then, and also we'll say if they're equal to 0 and it's, at the same time, while you're checking that, also spin this, basically show this thing. And we're going to show an image basically here. I'm going to say and I'm going to show an image here. So I'm just going to say image source. I'm just going to grab the source. It's just a GIF or a GIF, whatever. I'm going to put it right here. And then I'm just going to give it the alt because it will not work without alt. Spinner. And then I'm going to close that. Okay. So, oh, okay, I missed out this one. I'm going to close it in here. Okay, so as you can see, it does that thing for like 3 seconds. We can make it like 2 seconds. And then it does the 2 seconds, and then boom, it shows the animals. So that's kind of like how it renders usually. But the main thing to understand is component did mount, how to use it. We could set up an API here if you want, but that's the general idea. Any questions?
You refresh it, please.
Refresh here?
Or refresh it. Yeah, refresh it. Okay.
Gonna spin for like a second. But the general idea is component did mount is the same as use effect. You could also use component will unmount. That's usually used when you wanna like kind of let the person know, hey, the person is about to leave the component or they're about to move away somewhere else. So you could just create component will unmount and just put whatever that you want to tell the person before they leave the application here. So we could give a console log and say, hey, you're leaving. Okay, so to say something like that. I don't know why this is going immediately before the occurrence. Okay. So as you can see here, they give me that description. They say called immediately before mounting occurs, before the, okay, whatever. But the main thing, component will, no, this one will unmount. No, will mount. Will unmount. If we check the here, and when we refresh, and when we refresh this runs, but let's see if we can, I don't know if we can close it. Let's see. Yeah, I think there's no way, unless we close the whole browser, it will not trigger that. There could be other ways that we can render. Let's see, component will unmount. Let's see other ways that we can render. So as you see here, yeah, so usually you will see that a lot of times when you use event listeners like this, if you add any event listener, you want to remove the event listener manually. So use the component will unmount to whenever the component kind of gets removed from the UI, then you want to remove the event listeners. So usually that's kind of like the things that you want to use for component will unmount. What else? Let's see. Component will update, component will unmount. As you can see, this person is destroying this React DOM, destroying something. I don't know what it is. Component will unmount, console log, component unmount, clear intervals. So also, let's say when you use an intervals, so JavaScript has or the DOM has a set interval, just like set timeout. And you want to, like, let's say you want to remove the interval, just keeps going. It keeps going, like it keeps adding something to it. If you want to remove it, you could use it inside the component will unmount and then say clear intervals, and then you give the interval to clear. So that this would be the state. And that's kind of the ways that you will use for component will unmount. So usually most of the time you'll be using just, let's see, you'll be using only component did mount, and also you could use component will update, because if you want to update the state, then that's what you could use. But the same way we just updated here the state, you could use the component did mount. So from my experience, usually I just use component did mount, put all my APIs here, anything that I want to render, and I don't want it to affect the application or the render of the application. I'm not sure about it, like set timeouts, set intervals, API calls, things like that. I just put it inside here. Any question? Yeah. Any questions so far? So let's see. Let's go to the assignment at the lesson here. So as you can see, you could read this: the birth, the death, all that stuff. Constructor, the render, component did mount, update component will unmount. Okay, so it goes deep into each section that we talked about. It gives you a small challenge, and then that's pretty much it. Let's see this example. This example here. Okay, so we could also work with this. We could just try this. Basically, this is supposed to be another another thing that I was going to show you guys. It's the API for the dogs. So there's a dog API. So now it's not properly set up. So let's properly set up this thing. So as you can see, we have the state here. It's saying basically, can I grab the state? So let's see if this is actually working. Copy this and go here. Is it showing anything? So as you can see, the API is not even showing anything. So let's go grab the API, proper API. So this would be, we want all the list of all the dogs or something. Let's just grab, okay, we don't want a random documentation. So here's what are we looking for? All. Let's just replace that. Where is it? Let's replace this with that. Still not showing. Let's see what this gives us. Gives us a lot of stuff. Read a list. Okay. Can we say something like documentation by breed, subbreed? Okay, yeah, this is what we're looking for, images. All right, so this is it. So let's copy paste this. Okay, so as you can see, it's showing all the docs and stuff. So that's nice. Here's an actual API. So as you can see, we're using fetch. This is something new you guys can learn. Instead of Axios, we're using fetch. Keep in mind that fetch is a built-in kind of like API fetcher or whatever, just like Axios. So Axios is a third party. So you have to kind of import Axios here, or you have to install Axios, but fetch is part of JavaScript. So it's the same thing as Axios. And then we say .then, JSON, and then we have two .thens, that's fine. So this one, the first thing is converting to a JSON. So all the data that we get, all this data, it's converting it to a JSON. And then the next one is it's taking that information and then it's setting it to state. It's right here, the state. So it's setting it to state, and docs.message is the information that we're looking for, which is this. And then after that, you just grab each doc, the URL. So that's what we're showing here. We're saying hello. We say here, just say here docs. Remove this if we want. And then it's basically mapping over it, and then showing the image of the dog. It's missing an alt here. So this is how you use it in API, actual API. There is, so it's just like user fed. So don't complicate it, don't make it too complicated. Now that we have that, we can go to the assignment and show you that, what we're gonna do. So the assignment, remember that, I think this is the GitHub user profile thing. Let's see. Yeah. So remember you guys, I think, worked on one before like this. Did you guys work on a GitHub profile thing?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, I think you guys did when we were doing
The
JavaScript.
picture and the information of the person and everything.
Yep. So I think it was this one. GitHub user API. It's the same thing, or I think this is the same thing. I think let's put a GitHub here. GitHub social.
Yeah, the social media.
Okay. So this is the one you guys worked on. Okay. I showed you like, I think I put an image here or something. I set up something for you. And I showed you, I'll write a preview example. Oh, this is too big. Okay, let's copy the image URL. This is how it looked like. So you guys gonna be building this, but React using class components, right? I think that's kind of like the idea for this one. Hopefully it's the same thing. So let's go through this. So project allows you to practice concept techniques learned in this module, blah, blah. You're going to be using the lifecycle methods like component and did mount. Okay. The usual stuff, minimum viable product, fetch data from GitHub API for GitHub user, display the user data on the DOM, use class component to when need to hold any state of lifecycle. Planning. This is an important data. Also, you guys can use the same HTML and CSS that you guys used for the previous one. So if you could go find that, that would be fine. Not the HTML, I mean, yeah, you could convert the HTML to JSX. Hopefully you guys can do that for now. So that's what you could do. Also, since you have a GitHub API before, some catch-up, make sure okay. When you have those completed, you have start coding fetching. Okay, fetching, just fetching the API from GitHub, display user. You could pass the data to another component, and then display that way. Build a user card using data. So same thing. Another thing is you could also fetch your followers and things like that. Style your card, project retrospective. Now that you have completed MVP on choosing process, take a look. Plan better. Okay, so you can read all this stuff for yourself, but keep in mind that this is due over the weekend. So try to finish it by Saturday, by tomorrow. Another thing, announcement. Let me just stop the recording for people who will be